Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Great Century in our study of church history. Now, the Great Century is going to be what we call the 19th century. We've already come to that in our look when we came to the Second Great Awakening that started in the late 1700s and took us into the 1800s. But this is also going to be the time when we see the growth and advent of the modern missionary movement. And we're going to start with William Carey. We'll also mention Livingston and Hudson Taylor as just a few of the outstanding missionary enterprises. William Carey was a shoemaker who had come to know the Lord, and he was impassioned with the gospel. He was in a church known as the Particular Baptist, and he continued to be of that denomination throughout his life. That meant he was a Calvinist. He believed that God had ordained who should be saved, and not only who should be saved, but the means by which they should be saved. Now, it was a deacon in that church who, when Carey expressed his desire to go and preach the gospel to the unsaved people throughout the world, supposedly said, "Young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid and mine." Now, that was a wrong view. Just because God is sovereign doesn't mean that God has not also ordained who will take the gospel. And that was Carey's mindset. Carey went on to become a pastor of the church there in England, and his motto was expect great things from God. If God's in control, you can expect great things from him, and attempt great things for God. And so he becomes a missionary to India, and he relocates to the country of India. Now, he's self-supporting. He doesn't have, a big mission organization behind him, and so he goes there making shoes. That's how he's supporting himself, but his real reason for going there was to spread the gospel. And so he engages in communal living because there's not a lot of housing, so he and others of his team end up, just living in purchasing, one or two places to live, and then whoever can fit in there comes and lives together. He works on having the Bible translated into the various Indian dialects. Now, India was a possession of Great Britain at that time, but not everybody in India spoke English, and so there were a number of different dialects, and he has the Bible translated into those various dialects. He also begins an accredited college with the purpose of training people in both Bible, to be pastors, but also just to be leaders in India. Another missionary enterprise beginning at this very early date is actually comes about as a result of a number of students that were out in a field during a thunderstorm, and they began praying. 5 students at Williams College in Massachusetts, and they went and hid in a haystack because they were afraid they might get hit by lightning. I'm not sure how helpful that was, but they didn't get hit. And later on, this became a movement that started student missionary societies, both there in that college and in other colleges as well. In fact, I understand you can go to that field and you'll find a sort of a plaque or monument or something to the haystack, and it really is to what God did there in that field. So we have there the advent of student missionary societies. Now, another missionary from this, he's later in the 1800s, and this is Hudson Taylor. He's going to be a missionary to China, but he's not just going to China. There had been several that had come to China before, but they'd always stayed on the coast because that's what's easy to get to, and so instead he's going to go inland, and he's going to found the China Inland Mission, about reaching the unreached part of that huge area. A total of 800 missionaries from various denominations ultimately come through his mission program. And he founds something like 125 different schools. He adopts Chinese clothing. Instead of the European trying to get Chinese to act like good little Europeans, he adopts their manner of dress, their speech, even their hairstyle. The Chinese would often, wear their hair very long and in sort of a ponytail, and he grows his hair long like that to be like them, just as Jesus became like us, taking on flesh, he was taking on the manners and customs, not the pagan practices, but the manners and customs of the Chinese whom he was trying to reach. He says, if I had 1,000 pounds, remember that pounds were a British unit of money back then, if I had 1,000 pounds, China should have it. If I had 1,000 lives, China should have them. No, not China, but Christ. Can we do too much for him? Can we do enough for such a precious Savior? His motto was that God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. Now, some of the other things that are happening in this same period, unrelated to mission work, one is the ministry of a person by the name of John Nelson Darby. He's in England, and he comes up with a system of theology, something that had not been previously conceived, and it's going to catch on, and it still has its impact even in our culture today, among Christians today. He sort of invents, if I can use that term, or it grows in his mind, and he begins teaching a system of theology that will come to be known as dispensationalism. Now, that's a big word, and it's describing a view that sees the idea that God has two separate plans and two separate peoples. I'm not talking about believers versus unbelievers, but that God has two separate holy people. That is Israel in the Old Testament, and then the church in the New Testament, and never the twain shall meet. Now, that's been modified in more modern cases of dispensationalism, where they say, well, maybe they'll meet someday, but so far they haven't. And so in the Old Testament, God was dealing with people one way, with Israel and through law, and gave them promises. And then we sort of stop the stopwatch when we get to Acts chapter 2, and he puts them on hold, and now he begins a new plan and a new people, and that is the church. Yes, you can have Jewish people in the church as well as Gentiles, but it's a different plan and a different people and a different destiny. And then there comes a time in the future where they're going to be sort of raptured up, and that's the term that is used to describe that event in dispensationalism. And then God's going to sort of restart the stopwatch and go back to dealing with Jewish people and the law, and he'll do that for a while, and he sort of goes back and forth, but he never mixes them. And so there's two kinds of two plans and two peoples. There's also two kinds of Christians. There are spiritual Christians, and then there are not so spiritual Christians. That is, he would call fleshly Christians. Now, most Bible scholars and Bible readers, even before Darby, would have said, well, there's two kinds of people. There's believers and unbelievers, and that's can be described as spiritual versus fleshly. But Darby said, no, there's actually two kinds of Christians. There's spiritual Christians, and then there's Christians that look like pagans, but they're not really pagans. They're just fleshly Christians. Another aspect of dispensationalism is that Jesus has two future comings, that he is, and this is wrapped up in the two plans and two peoples, because one of these days Jesus is going to come, but he's only going to come for the church, and he's going to take them away, and then he's going to be working with Israel again in a 7-year tribulation, and at the end of that time you have the second coming, and you can't really talk about two future second comings. That just doesn't sound right. So the term that's been used to designate them is that you call that first second coming the rapture, and then the second coming, which sounds like a mouthful, you just talk about the second coming after the rapture as a different event. That's the second coming, when Jesus, and then it's always dispensationalism is always premillennial. So you have a 1,000-year literal millennium. Now that part wasn't a new idea. That goes all the way back to the second or even maybe the first century, just a literal reading of Revelation chapter 12. But this idea that God had two separate plans and two separate people, and Christ had two future comings, and there's two kinds of Christians, spiritual and fleshly, these were all new innovations. Nobody in the last 1,800 years had ever dreamed such an idea. That doesn't make it wrong, but it just makes it where the Bible's not obviously teaching such a thing. And so Darby comes out with this, and initially it's a very small group, but it begins to grow, first in England and eventually in the United States. So that by 1900, dispensationalism is actually going to be becoming quite popular, thanks to some preachers and street preachers that we're going to look at next week. Now, not to put these two in the same camp, because Darby and the dispensationalists, those are Christians. I think they might have some ideas that are a bit funny, but they're Christians. As opposed to the next one I want to talk about, and that's Joseph Smith, the founder of what comes to be called popularly as the Mormons. They refer to it as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And Joseph Smith claims to have had an angelic vision where an angel showed up and gave him some gold tablets that were written in Reformed Egyptian that nobody else could see, but nobody else could read unless you had these magic spectacles, these big giant glasses that you would put over your face and look at them, and then it would magically translate it into King James English. It's sort of a wild story, but again, he obtains some adherents, and they go through some tough times and even persecuted times. But they eventually relocate, and they get to Utah, which is virtually an unknown territory, and they settle there. And many years later, Utah becomes a state, but it's largely Mormon, and has that influence even to this day. Now, another one, notice this is all bunched up taking place around the same time, but as I said, I don't want to put them all in the same camp because they're very different. The Millerites. William Miller, he is going to give rise to the Seventh-day Adventists. What happens is he's a Bible student and Bible teacher, and he's been reading his Bible about the second coming of Jesus, and he looks at some passages that talk about numbers when different things take place, and he says, I have figured it out. People do this every once in a while. They say, I figured out when Jesus is going to come, and he sets a date. Forget the exact date. It was like 1840 something, and he said, that's when Jesus is coming. I figured out sort of the secret Bible code, and he tells his followers, and they get all ready, geared up, and they get on a high place on that day, and they're dressed in white and ready to go, and Jesus doesn't come. And he says, oh, I must have missed it by a couple of, and he goes back and restudies, and he says, well, I was close, but I still missed it, but here's when Jesus is going to come now. And again, they get all psyched up, and again, he doesn't come. This group eventually will give rise to the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, the reason they're called that is because they're worshiping on Saturday instead of Sunday, which, hey, you worship any day you like. I think that's a wonderful thing. But they're insisting that that's the mark of the true Christian. That if you're only a true Christian if you worship on the seventh day, and you've blown it if you worship on some other day. Paul has something to say about that. He speaks about, one day one man looks at one day, another one thinks every day is great, and let each one be fully persuaded in his own eyes, and don't go judging each other over that issue. So I think there's some problems there. Not with what day they worship, although Christians had traditionally been worshiping on the first day of the week since all the way back in the book of Acts. You can see references to it as early as that. But, I don't want to make that an issue, but that's the point. We shouldn't be making that an issue. Now, it's going to be in the 1850s when Darwin publishes his Origin of the Species, and that is going to capture the world by storm, and that's going to have a tremendous impact both there and even in theology. And we'll be looking next week at how that plays out.